Episode 3 ended with a hard truth that many leaders don't want to admit. How leadership unknowingly teaches teams what really matters when stress hits. Because before leadership becomes dysfunctional, it becomes disconnected. These are leaders who care deeply, who are capable, leaders who once said things like, "My door is always open." And then one day, the door is open, but their calendar is booked until 2037. But then something happens, little by little, creating this space, a space between leaders and people, between expectations and experience, between results and relationships. And you know what I call that space? The compassion gap. Not because leaders stop caring, but because caring becomes expensive. Expensive in time, expensive in energy, expensive in emotional bandwidth. Because pressure doesn't eliminate the compassion. It misaligns it, and leaders deprioritize it, which is leadership speak for you think you're doing the right thing, but your team is feeling something else. Hello, I'm Antrea Dowd, and this is Purpose Presents People. And today, we're going to go one layer deeper than we did in episode 3. We're going to take leadership back from the stress, back from the urgency. We're going to get out of survival mode. And we are putting it back where it belongs, with intentional human leadership. Because once leaders disconnect from their people, something dangerous shows up. No, not conflict. Not chaos. The compassion gap. The distance between what leaders feel and what teams experience. Okay, so let me start this off with a question. When was the last time you meant to be compassionate, but your team experienced you as maybe distant, rushed, or transactional? Because here's what episode 3 revealed. Under pressure, leaders don't become worse people. They become less accessible humans. And today, we're talking about what happens in that space between leadership and impact. This conversation is needed today because leadership isn't failing from lack of intelligence. It's breaking down from disconnection. In the moments when someone almost speaks and decides not to, the moments when feedback is withheld or softened, moments when truth stays silent because it doesn't feel safe enough to land. If you've ever felt that pressure changed how you showed up as a leader, just nod. It's okay. It's just me and you here. This is a safe space. Because the answer to that question determines more than culture. It determines the level of trust. So I need you to get comfortable with being uncomfortable as we discuss the price organizations pay when leaders lack compassion. Now, let's go ahead and get started with this much needed conversation. I'm Antrea Dowd, leadership strategist, speaker, and former director of patient experience with a foundation in leadership and organizational development. I've spent my career helping leaders show up with presence, communicate with intention, and drive results through people, not pressure. This podcast is about leadership that's practical, human, and impactful. Let's begin. In leadership development, we talk about something called the behavioral drift. This is what happens when behavior is under sustained pressure. The compassion gap is a drift, not a decision. As complexity increases, leaders unconsciously shift from relationship to task, from curiosity to efficiency, from presence to productivity. Not because they lack information, they drift because their habits no longer match their intent. Not because they don't care, but because no one trained them to lead emotionally under pressure. They're not developed for emotional authority because leaders without compassion, it doesn't just damage culture. It damages performance. And so this compassion gap isn't about leaders being mean. It's about leaders being busy. Too busy to notice tone. Too busy to ask a second question. Too busy to slow down when someone's energy has shifted. You know, the interesting thing is most leaders I coach believe that they're compassionate. And I will tell you, most of the time they're right. And so the problem isn't lack of compassion. It's a delivery breakdown. You see, compassion doesn't disappear under pressure. It just gets stuck in your head and never makes it to your face. However, all jokes aside, let me tell you what makes this compassion gap dangerous. You see, leaders judge themselves by their intent. Teams judge leaders by the way they experience them. And the worst part of it is that the leaders are the last to know that there's a gap at all. And so let's talk about this neurologically. Social science gives us a language for this, right? Under cognitive load, deadlines, metrics, staffing, inboxes, right? The brain begins to prioritize task completion over emotional signaling. You don't lose empathy. What happens is you lose expressiveness. Your heart is still on, but your signals are in airplane mode. And the team doesn't respond to what you intend as a leader. They respond to what leaders emit. They don't listen for compassion. They scan the room and watch for it. Here's the tricky part. While the gap continues to grow in the background and outcomes begin to decline, everyone is still polite. Everyone says good morning. Meetings still happen. Emails are still sent with the thanks and thumbs up, right? But underneath, psychological safety drops. People stop speaking up. Your high performers, they go quiet. And leaders say things like, I don't know why engagement is down. We haven't changed anything. Exactly. Leaders often try to fix these outcomes without addressing the behavior that has caused them in the first place. I am so sorry, you guys. You cannot KPI your way out of the compassion gap. Engagement is not a motivation issue. It's a leadership experience problem. And those signals that you're sending, when they disappear, teams don't assume that you're stressed. They assume that you're disinterested in what they have to say. You're disinterested in how they feel. Let me tell you about a leader I coached. Brilliant, metrics driven, very respected by her colleagues, and completely shocked when we did her 360 and her team said, we don't feel supported. Her team described her as cold. She was stunned. She said that can't be true. I care deeply about my team. I just don't have time to manage their emotions. Well, what her team experienced was urgency without presence, direction without acknowledgement. That moment changed how I teach leadership because I realized that compassion isn't a value. It's a behavioral signal. It's what leaders feel and what teams actually receive. Compassion doesn't fail from lack of heart. It fails from lack of structure. So in episode 4, by now, you have realized that I like to do micro learning sessions. And I do it because you can change a lot with a very small amount of effort. So this new one is called Compassion Collaboration. It's a 30-second leadership reset to ensure your internal creativity becomes external experience. And so step 1 is pause the task. This is not about slowing down work. It's about slowing you, right? You slow down. You don't stop working. You stop rushing past the human, right? High competent leaders like to jump in and explain things quickly because I got 0.5 seconds to have this conversation with you. While on the other hand, compassionate leaders acknowledge before they explain. And so I challenge you, before your next interaction today, pause for 5 seconds and ask, what is my energy signaling right now? Let's move on to step 2. Name the human context. Before correction, instruction, or decision, I want you to name the reality in the room because correction protects the standards, right? But connection protects the engagement. And so an example can be, I know that's frustrating. I see how much you are juggling. This is a tough moment. Step 3, calibrate your signal. This is where calibration kicks in. You have to decide to either move or stay. Staying in the moment, especially when it's uncomfortable. This, ladies and gentlemen, is where you build the trust. So ask yourself this question. If I were on the receiving end, what would I feel right now? What is my body teaching right now? Same words, different body, totally different leader. This works because it's neurologically efficient. Remember earlier we talked about teams regulating around you, right? And so teams regulate faster when leaders signal that it's safe. Translation, you save time by slowing down, just not the way your inbox would like you to. And believe it or not, you actually have the time for this because compassion isn't a personality trait. It is a pause that you practice. Now, we don't learn leadership by listening. If that worked, one podcast would have fixed everything and I wouldn't even be on episode 4. Skills stick when they're embedded and not remembered, which is great because who needs one more thing to remember? You see, culture doesn't change through slogans that you see or that you read. It changes through repeated leadership behavior. We've discussed earlier that it can change for the good or it can change for the bad. When leaders calibrate compassion, we see a couple of things happen. Lower defensiveness amongst the team, higher trust in you as a leader, faster recovery from conflict. Think about how long conflict has derailed the team. And then better engagement scores, stronger retention. This is why I teach this in my leadership workshops, because compassion isn't soft. It's strategic regulation, and it is a trainable leadership skill. When you get to this level of leadership, you notice that things start to change. You stop asking yourself, did I say that right? Was I clear? And you start saying, how did my presence shape the moment? Did my authority make it safe or unsafe? Leadership doesn't fail when compassion disappears. It actually stalls. And stalled leadership quietly limits teams and impacts outcomes. Now, here's the part that we don't talk enough about. Closing the compassion gap, it doesn't fix everything. In fact, it sometimes makes things a little worse before it gets better. Why? Because the moment compassion returns to the room, people start remembering. They remember what it felt like not to be heard. They remember what it felt like not to be seen, not to feel safe enough to speak. And so leaders usually ask me, so what do I do when compassion opens the door, but trust hasn't walked through it yet? Here's the truth. Compassion alone doesn't rebuild teams. All it does is open the door. Trust decides whether to walk through it. Trust doesn't return just because leaders are kinder, or they explain more, or they say the right thing once. Remember, you didn't get here overnight, so you're not going to fix it overnight. Trust will return when leaders learn how to stay present after the hard moments surface. Now, this is usually in my workshop class where leaders look around and go, wait a minute, we're not done? No. And then they realize, wow, this is going to take longer than a staff meeting. Yes, it is. Because this is where leadership actually begins. And so here's a real question for you. If compassion is present in your heart, but missing in your leadership signals, what is your team learning in the moments that matter most? In episode 5, we're going to talk about what happens after the gap has been exposed, rebuild trust, and how the impact didn't match intent. Because awareness is powerful, but repair, that's leadership. And so I leave you with this. When the compassion gap shows up, will your leadership widen it or close it? Purpose, presence, people. Leadership lives in the moments that matter most, how you listen, respond, and lead under pressure. Take one idea from today and put it into practice. Thank you for listening. And remember, lead with intention, and I'll see you next time.